Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one appears in Boy's Life, and in particular the September 1968 edition of Boy's Life magazine, the magazine for Boy Scouts. So, unlike the previous one in Boy's Life, the one about the man who invented the 20th century, made the 20th century, and that never saw the light of day again. So, I mean, that's a rarity. This one did, however, get gathered up and printed into By Jupiter and Other Stories. So this, is much, thankfully, I guess, from the standpoint of anyone who wants to read the story, it's much easier to find. So, once again, we have a little table. Let's see, is it mentioned on the cover? No, it does not. We have a little table of contents where it says under the category of fiction, there it is. A Proper Study, Isaac Asimov, and there's our page number 32. So let's go to page 32. And note, there is no artwork associated with it. There it is, The Proper Study, and almost all of it fits on this one page. By the way, his friend, Fred Pohl Anderson, not Fred Pohl. Don't get the two mixed up. Pohl Anderson, was asked also to write a story around some sort of a bit of artwork that was shown to both of them. It was there's a write-up in the By Jupiter book. I'll just read that. It talks about what it was, which artwork is not included in here, by the way, associated with either story, I might add. At any rate, there's no artwork associated with it. So the artwork is never seen, but Asimov had to come up with something, and I think credibly he did. That's actually kind of a neat concept. So what we've got is called the neurophotoscope. It's this top secret thing, but the guy working on the neurophotoscope, he's got kind of this different sort of scientific ideal. I guess he kind of sees himself as being a little bit like Oppenheimer, who kind of felt like the secret of the atomic bomb is something best shared by all sides because it's just too, it would just give way, way, way too much of an advantage. And that's basically what made him be willing to share its secrets with a foreign government and enable them to have theirs not long after we had ours. And now we have to deal with that. I mean, thank you, Mr. Oppenheimer. I understand what you're doing, but now we're seeing the effects of it. Or at least we could. The danger resurfaces as I'm speaking of this. But that's another bucket of bananas. And what we have here now is that there's going to be a demonstration to a general. He's finally persuaded some military general who is a person with enough authority to declassify what he's doing. And it turns out that he's got an interesting gimmick, because you see this neurophotoscope can take the brain waves and interpret them into some colorful pattern that kind of reflects what the brain is doing. I kind of picture it making a pattern, sort of like, if you rub your eyes and you see all the little designs and stuff going in front of your eyes, it probably look about like that. I kind of picture something like that, but it's somehow relating directly to the brainwaves of the person whose brainwaves are being scanned. And they have this person, a mere person to be experimented on by the name of Steve, whether that's really his name or not, and they're just calling him Steve. And indeed, the text of this is substantially identical to the text in the final book. I've got two differences. It's at least two notable differences. There might be one or two very trivial ones, I'm not sure, but there's two particularly notable differences. And I'll start with the more notable of them. There's a paragraph where they're describing this subject. As it originally appears, they're asking about who is this test subject. Who is he? Asked the general. The only name we use for him is Steve. He is not mentally alert, but produces the most intense patterns we have yet found. He makes a great test subject because I guess unlike most people, you hook him up to this thing and the designs are just too fast and complicated. But here's this guy, what did it say? Not mentally alert, kind of slow of mind. I'll leave it at that for the moment. So the patterns, I guess, could be seen, appreciated, and really very persuasive. It captures his mood based on his brainwaves. So first he gets a little disturbed because the general is kind of arrogant and kind of, so what, so what? Why are you showing me this kind of, just back attitude, with every little decor, decoration exactly where it's supposed to be. The guy was crisping. Let's see here. Everything about the general was crisp. His walk, the way he held his spine, the way he spoke. He was all straight lines and angles, adhering rigidly at all points to the etiquette of the born soldier. Anyway, and so it begins to disturb Steve, and this pattern that's floating over his head, as discovered, created, and then translated into artwork over his head, gets kind of more and more complicated and a little less friendly looking. And then they give him some sort of a book thing. It's like a little pop-up book with little colorful things. It sounds like it'd be kind of a very interesting high-tech pop-up book, frankly. But at any rate, Steve looks at this thing, and suddenly the patterns become very smooth, and they get his emotion gets warm and friendly, and so does these little things. And okay, well, we heard about it here. He's not mentally alert. Now, when this story got gathered up into By Jupiter, this is unbelievable. They don't say this anymore. I'm going to say something here. I'm just quoting Isaac Asimov, okay? And they said, oh, this is the wrong story. That's why it's not there. Okay. All right. So, it's just subject. Where is it? Okay. Find this here. Alright, we have our new test subject. Okay. Who is it? Said the general. Asked the general. The only name we use for him is Steve. He is mentally retarded, but produces the most intense patterns we have yet found. Nobody says that anymore. But he actually, in going from the original where it just said he is not mentally alert, you could still say that about somebody who's a little slow of mind, to he is mentally retarded. You don't say that now. That's, that's like, kind of next door neighbor across the street from using the N-word almost. You don't use that anymore. But I guess in 1975, when he's gathering this story into By Jupiter, that was still a common phrase, and they didn't know back then. They didn't think about it. It is obviously impolite, so that expression has, with some reasonable degree of appropriateness, fallen into disuse. I don't think it's right to criminalize these things, but I think it is kind of fair to say that when a person talks like that or uses such expressions, they are being impolite. So, like I say, time will probably come when that phrase will actually be, from maybe even on par with the infamous N-word. Okay. Well, the story continues a little bit more on page 69, and as he's introducing this whole story to the general, this whole device, and showing this thing, and this is it's kind of a neat thing. Well, the general, this thing he's discovering, this could be useful in controlling and manipulating people's minds. And so this could be useful. And so the general remains silent. Now, okay, right before this. Alright, originally we just had here, that's what should concern us above all, and then here's a quoting, quote, the proper study of mankind is man, unquote. So the proper study is just a short part of that whole quote. Okay. As Alexander Pope once said, the general remains silent. However, when you gather it up into here, it becomes, that should concern us above all. The proper study of mankind is man, as Alexander Pope once said. And what is man but his brain? So there's a little addition there. So there's another thing. It's in both equally, so I'll just go back to the original quote here. A rather disturbing little paragraph. Just thrown in there on it, just randomly. But I guess we're looking at the idea of, that does lead to at least one of the other differences, but it's very minor. Okay. And so he's talking about here. I mean emotion. If the subject feels anger, the receiver can be made to experience anger, right? In a manner of speaking. The general was clearly agitated. Those things right there, he's looking at the patterns which were whirling most unpleasantly now over Steve's head. Steve's getting kind of disturbed at this point. Okay. They can be used for emotional control. With these broadcast on television, whole populations can be emotionally manipulated. Can we allow such power to fall into the wrong hands? If it were such power, said Harding mildly, there would be no right hands. Good point. But the general's all, I wanted it ours, we don't want it anybody else's. He's being an Oppenheimer, says, no, this should be everybody. Give this to the whole scientific community, and everybody has it equally. At least every nation will have it equally. Okay. And then Fife. Yeah. Three main characters. We've got the general. He gives his name, General Grunwald. We have Oscar Harding, who's the main guy who's invented this thing. And then he's got kind of an assistant or associate, his young associate, Ben Fife. Now, there's a name we haven't seen since the Currents of Space. I don't know. It's just a funny coincidence to see a familiar name in a very unfamiliar context. Okay. Fife frowned. That was a dangerous remark. Yeah. Every once in a while, Harding seemed to forget the old days of democracy were gone. And we just go on, yeah. And so what? The old days. Yeah, we used to have this thing called democracy, but that doesn't exist anymore. Now we just manipulate the crowds, and that's good enough. I don't know. That's a disturbing little paragraph, just thrown in there amongst all this other stuff. I'm kind of curious to see what he has to say about democracy when we get to the Benjamin Franklin series that's coming up before too much longer. At any rate, suffice it to say, and this probably gives away most of the story. Well, I'm going to use the one quote. I think it is actually better. But the manipulation in the story, in effect, ends up helping persuade the general to be willing to declassify it. They affected his mind by using it on him. And they have rather... I'll save this as at least a partial half spoiler. Why does it influence the general? Maybe more than it might have influenced others. That's kind of cute. It's a nice... they have a nice little explanation of that, which is... Get out the story and read it. You will not be disappointed with that. So, but now that everybody will have it, mankind can begin its proper study in earnest at last. Now he gives the story of how this came about, which I say I was going to get to this. He says, the painting was simply a crudely done head surrounded by a series of aimless psychedelic designs. It meant nothing to me, and I had a terrible time thinking up the proper study. Poul Anderson also wrote a story based on the same painting, and probably had no trouble at all. The two stories appeared in the same issue, and I suppose it might be interesting to compare the stories and try to get an idea of the different workings of Poul's brain and mind. But, as in the case of blank, I didn't say the other story. Besides, I don't want you to compare brains. Pohl is awfully bright, and you might come to me with some hard truths I'd rather not face. Yeah, I looked at his story. I didn't read it all the way through. It is you can't completely. We're not. These are like they're totally different than the whole nature of the story. Pohl's comes across as being like well, we're not just talking apples and oranges here. Probably something more like apples and hand grenades or something. I mean, his story is called The Fawn. So it has a wyvern flew up in a thunder of splendid wings. A python tree coiled its branches. It's fantasy. Total fantasy. The proper study is proper science fiction per se. As I said, apples and hand grenades. Totally different categories, despite the similar size. So, at any rate, that's about the proper study. And so finally, the stories, as he puts it in the boy's life, are finally beginning to be making an appearance in other books, at least usually. And that is the proper study. Thanks for listening.